Okay. Good morning. The Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation will now convene this roundtable. The committee will hear and accept testimonies both orally and writtenly on the following. The roundtable on the non-appropriate funds. All right? It is now, let's get the right time, it is now 8:39 and July 20th here at the Guam Legislature public hearing room. Public hearing notice were given to the media on Thursday, July 6, 2017. Second notice on Monday, July 17. And for the record, today is Thursday, July 20th, and the time is 8:39. I just got to read the rules of engagement here, all right? The roundtable meeting on the Guam Department of Education non-appropriate fund. The allegation of theft, which has gone unreported to the proper authorities, and to ensure full disclosure and public accountability of monies appropriate or raised to support our public school students and their activities. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Senator Will Castro joining me. The conduct of this roundtable hearing shall be as those testifying will be recognized in the order of the signing in, but we have the board here and the members of the Department of Education. So we'll start with the superintendent, then we'll move to the board members. Length in written testimony should be summarized to about 5 minutes. If any of the other members would like to yield their time, then they'll yield their time to the other members. Okay? If you have any written testimony, I highly recommend that you provide that to my staff so that everybody will get a copy of that. The testimony shall be confined to the substance of this roundtable. Persons will be allowed to present oral testimony only once. You may be asked questions, but you only get a chance to present the testimony once. All right? When you speak, please make sure that the microphone is on and that you speak into the microphone. Please state your name for the record. We will now begin with we'll start what you prefer. Okay, we'll have the board member Mark Mendiola start with his testimony first.
Buenas and Hafade, and I'm Mr. Mark Mendiola. I am the chair of the Budget and Finance Committee of the Department of Education. Who agradece esta oportunidad na nasaw na kami ni STE aridondo na lamasa za periak mon ta diskudi STE po di sidanteta gi Department of Education. I just want to wish everyone a happy Liberation Day. Hope that everybody can come out and join us also for our Liberation Day festivities. I'm grateful for the opportunity to come before you, Honorable Senator San Agustin, Chair of the Education Committee, and Honorable Will Castro, member of the Committee on Education. Before I read my testimony, I also just like to extend a uncle and Jesus Masi for the support from the legislature that we received yesterday, a handsome check for the renovation and repairs of some of the schools that the board is well aware and behind the superintendent's support for getting our schools ready. It's a great help for our education system. Jesus Masi. Safari, Chairman San Agustin and members of the committee, I come before you on behalf of the Guam Education Board as chair of the Budget and Finance Subcommittee, which has oversight over policies relating to the department's financial responsibilities, including management of non-appropriated funds, also known as NAF. I am here to support the department in its presentation today and to assure you that the board's commitment to working with the superintendent to ensure that we are properly managing the funds that are raised at schools to support student activities. Although I'm relatively new to my position on the board, I am familiar with NAF in my role as a parent and as a parent-teacher organization past president within GDOE. It is important that we continue to do our best to help raise funds and identify resources to support our student organizations. However, we also recognize that a system where we are dealing with a significant volume of cash transaction is ripe for abuse or misconduct, if we are not properly monitoring and reviewing these activities. The board plays a significant role in ensuring that we set high expectations for performance and accountability in addressing these responsibilities. And I just wanted to recognize the presence of the Chairman of the Board of Education, Mr. Rapia Ada, our Vice Chairperson, Ms. Maria Gutierrez, and Member Ms. Lou Beneventi. Board Policy 715 governs our current approach to NAF from a policy standpoint. It was originally approved in 1973 and last revised in 2005. Clearly, it is ripe for review, and we will be addressing this soon. The policy as drafted places responsibility for NAF solely with the principal of each school, requiring each school to develop the standard operating procedures that govern the accounting and expenditure of NAF. At this point, it means that we currently have 41 SOPs that are prepared and implemented throughout the school system. Board Policy 715 also sets forth basic guidelines for the operation of NAF accounts, solicitation of funds, fund disbursement, and reporting of NAF activities. It also outlines the roles and responsibilities of administrators, faculty, staff, students in handling NAF at each school. Since 2005, and especially over the past 5 years, GDOE has experienced some key improvements that will help us to improve our board policy. For instance, we shifted to a new financial management system which can now be used to easily monitor NAF accounts across the school system at any given time. The superintendent has built out the internal audit office to play a stronger role in reviewing and auditing NAF on a more comprehensive basis. We have invested in training opportunities for administrators and staff to build capacity throughout the school system. Because of this, it makes sense to ensure that our board policy reflects these changes in the overall organization. This may include more focus on how the central office, especially internal audit, can play a stronger role in identifying and addressing deficiencies in a more timely fashion. It may include more focus on the skills and training required before staff are allowed to handle the non-appropriated funds. It may include a focus on greater accountability for schools or employees that fail to show improvement in their management of non-appropriated funds. Upon receiving feedback at this hearing and input from our superintendent and the central office and school level managers, it is my plan to move quickly to complete review of Board Policy 715 and make any revisions that are necessary to improve NAF management at DOE. This is our board's commitment. This is my commitment as a parent on the Board of Education, parent representative on the Board of Education.
Thank you, Ms. Mendiola. We'll have now the superintendent provide his testimony before we move on with some nice questions for you folks.
Thank you, Senator San Agustin, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Vice Chair, Senator Castro. With me today, to my left, is, in addition to our board members who are here, is Frank Cooper Nurse, who was our Chief Auditor. Once I finish my presentation, he also would like to have a brief presentation as well to go into some of the details as to his audit, his role, and the his office's role in addressing NAF since he's been here over the past 3 years. To his left, the Deputy Superintendent Erica Cruz. Deputy Superintendent Cruz is oversees the principals, and because the principals have responsibility over NAF at their school, she is responsible for helping work to monitor and enforce accountability as we identify areas of improvement that need to take place. And then, of course, at the far end, the Deputy Superintendent Chris Anderson for assessment and accountability, and so he is also here to support the department's presentation here today. And when Ms. Cruz is not off island or not available in the office, he often serves as acting deputy, so he is also familiar with the roles and also as a former administrator. So we're here to be able to answer any questions that arise out of our presentation today. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify. As just for the general public's information, non-appropriated funds, or NAF, are basically referring to funds that are raised at the school level which are then used to support activities of student organizations or to support school-wide needs. And so this is an important issue to discuss, and we're glad that you're taking this opportunity to check in with us about where our progress and what we're experiencing. Before I go further, I know, this is something we spoke about earlier, I know the impetus for this hearing has been some recent concern about involving non-appropriated funds at Agustin Johnson Middle School, and because there's an ongoing investigation into this matter, I will defer any comments that pertain to the specifics in order to maintain the integrity of the investigation. However, we're happy to address issues related to NAF across the system. I want to assure you, though, that we do take that concern seriously, and it has been on our radar as a high priority. It's even risen to the level of us filing a police report on this issue because of whenever we have any concern about potential criminal activity, we then report that to law enforcement to ensure that they're able to take their actions appropriately. And also filing reports with the Bank of Guam whenever we believe that they need to be aware of any concerns. And then, of course, within the department, as an internal matter, we will take administrative action on this matter as merited. So I wanted to assure you that even though we can't discuss the specifics, we are actively working on all fronts to address the situation. Accountability for NAF is a significant responsibility for the department. On a yearly basis, GDOE reports upwards of $2 to $2.5 million in NAF that are on the books at any one time. And that reflects very active fundraising at our 41 schools. This amount is divided across roughly 50 separate bank accounts and over 900 subledgers, and represents 30,000 to 50,000 transactions. To manage an account for cash in a system as complex and large as ours is no easy task, and wherever cash is involved, we recognize there is always going to be an inherent risk of loss or misuse of funds. So I wanted to just emphasize that it would be a clean and easy approach for DOE to minimize this risk by simply not handling or allowing NAF at our campuses and eliminating that risk altogether. However, the challenge is that NAF is relied upon by our 31,000 students and families to support our student needs and events, including club activities, participation in off-item programs or competitions, award ceremonies, other similar uses. For this reason, GDOE allows and accepts responsibility for NAF, but it's our effort to ensure that we have a system in place to safeguard these funds for their appropriate use. The system that we currently have in place is anchored by public law, which sets forth some of the parameters for handling NAF. It is anchored by board policy, and then further by standard operating procedures, employee training, regular internal audit and review, and then enforcement by senior management. It is also anchored, as mentioned before, by a new financial management system called Munis that we implemented in 2012. Prior to shifting to this new system, our management of NAF involved many manual processes for reporting, monitoring, and auditing NAF accounts. It involved schools keeping records in boxes and tracking NAF accounts in Excel spreadsheets. It overwhelmed our auditors with one-time reporting at the end of the year and limited review of accounts to a small sampling of schools on a regular basis. This resulted in significant reliance on school-level oversight of NAF and made it impossible to be able to ensure compliance and accountability across the school system. And these limitations explain why NAF was identified as a significant deficiency in our annual audits for 14 years in a row, from fiscal year 2001 to fiscal year 2014. Today, we are glad to say that we do have an online, integrated, user-friendly financial management system that makes it easier to oversee NAF. We have updated our standard operating procedures to reflect use of our improved system. We provide annual NAF training to our key employees, and we are focused on our administrators, administrative officers, administrative assistants, who are primarily responsible for these duties. We regularly monitor reconciliation of NAF accounts at every school throughout the year, and we provide internal audit support to schools as needed and in a proactive and timely manner, and we involve senior management in addressing issues and deficiencies. Because of these efforts, we are at a point where management of NAF is steadily improving, and for the past two fiscal years, our external auditors have removed NAF as a significant deficiency and reduced it to a management comment, which it acknowledges the improvements that have been made in GDOE, but also recognizes room for continued improvement. So today we feel we are more transparent, proactive, and responsive to issues of NAF, and we believe and hope that we will continue this path of improvement. So it doesn't mean that we can reduce all risk in our system, but we hope it means that we are more able to readily detect failures and deficiencies, that we will be more timely and effective in assisting schools to improve their performance, and that we will detect and address misconduct more swiftly and effectively as we go forward. As a parent of 2 public school students, I'm intimately familiar with the efforts that go towards raising funds for student activities, whether it's for student events in elementary school or for programs like Close Up and for middle and high school students. The teachers and parents who lead these efforts spend a significant amount of time and effort to plan these events, to execute them, and to hopefully meet their fundraising goals so that students have the opportunities that they need to augment their education and represent their school communities. It can involve many hours, including on weekends, of washing cars, soliciting donations, selling T-shirts or snacks, and much, much more to support our kids. And because of this, we allow and support these staff activities, but because of these efforts, we want to make sure we account for every dollar and cent. So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to provide a brief overview of our commitments and improvements related to the accountability for NAF. Our one critical division in this system is our internal audit office, led by Chief Auditor Frank Cooper-Nurse, who is here, who can provide more detailed information regarding our handling of NAF from his office's perspective and experience. So we're here, and after his presentation, of course, we're here to answer any questions and any concerns, recommendations from you. We'd be happy to hear here. Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you, Superintendent John. And you have Frank, right? You have a presentation you want to present to us, and I thank you for joining the department, because I know you came from the OPA office, so most of the OPA reports I'll be looking at, I wouldn't be surprised if you wrote some of it.
I'm pretty sure I would have a hand in those audits.
You had a hand in it, right? So
yes.
We should be able to get all the answers, and that people of Guam will feel more comfortable that,
yes.
And the students, that all the money that's being raised throughout the year,
yes.
there's some sense of calm in their minds and in their heart that there's some control, or there is a full control with the department in reference to their funds.
Absolutely.
So you're going to present, you have a presentation then?
I do. I have my notes present. I believe we have our laptops. I'm not sure if it's set up, but I can go through my presentation for
Okay, well let's check with the folks. Do they have it?
Okay.
Okay, we're ready.
Okay. So, half a day, good morning, Senators. Mr. Fernandez really covered all the major points of our discussion relative to NAF, but this morning I'll be sharing with you and provide a little bit more insight into our system of review and accountability, the roles of the Internal Audit Office, and our notable improvements. And if I can just start by saying that, as you acknowledged, I came from the external audit standpoint. I was a longtime auditor with the Public Auditor's Office. I spent over 10 years there. So in the last 3 years, under my leadership as the chief auditor in the department, I've seen huge improvements in really the accountability over NAF. And accountability deals a lot with the responsibility of the individuals involved. So if I can speak to the volume first of NAF, as you heard, when we look at the significance of NAF, these numbers are quite high, and they're growing. And it's really dependent on the ability of schools and the commitment of teachers and the students to raise funds. I'm speaking to the last 3 years of data that I'm able to analyze, and over the last 3 years we had a high of $2.5 million, and we're averaging roughly around $2 million. When we look at the volume, earlier Mr. Fernandez said there's approximately 900 sub-accounts, right? So the way that's configured is each school is allowed to have 2 accounts. So we have NAF, and sub-NAF, we have what's called the SAF and the TAF. Quite simply, the SAF can be viewed as fundraising activities directly for the sole purpose of a student organization. And then the TAF, this is really the trust agency funds. This is what the school uses to benefit the school and the whole student body. And when we look at these accounts, again, the volume is quite large. We're looking at, in the average of the 3 years I've been there, my audit team has to review 25 to 30,000 transactions. That's simply because under your 2 accounts, the way it's structured, the schools are allowed to create those sub-accounts. And under those sub-accounts, we're requiring them now to be very proactive and diligent in recording their transactions. So as an audit standpoint, I can see what's going on. So to date, it's a long, laborious process to have constant monitoring, and then in return, and in the end of this, an annual audit. But to date, we're seeing the fruits of our labor. My audit team is performing very effectively, and it's really validated through the Deloitte audit, removing that significant deficiency, identifying it as a management letter comment. And that's not to say that the entire process is fixed. There's still some work to do. I acknowledge that. There's still some controls, and there's always going to be risk, right? But that's to say that, that's to really note the significant improvements made to date. So when we look at the system of review and accountability, I have to stress that from an audit standpoint, again, the accountability over NAF is not embedded in one person, and it's not a system fix. This is a collaborative and shared responsibility from all those who are involved to account for these funds. The funds and the primary source of funds we're talking about is cash. And the primary managers, well, the managers of these funds is at the school site. So we're talking from the student body to a club advisor to the business office, which has a designated school treasurer, and the administrator who has the sole custody and responsibility for the safekeep of those funds. So when we look at this system has been adequately and appropriately designed with its policies and procedures. We had the enabling legislation that really allowed for fundraising activities and specified how we're going to manage this. The board policy, in line with that public law, governed the utilization of funds and defined the account setup and the disbursement of these funds. At each level, that board policy allowed for each school to write its own specific SOP. While there's 40 SOPs currently, and each one of them are responsible for their separate SOP, there's a lot of overlap and consistencies with how we account for these funds. In addition to the school site SOPs, my internal audit office has created its SOP, which really governs how we audit, how we review, and defines the roles and responsibilities. Again, there's a very specific, when we look at the policy, it governs how the accounts are set up and what we can use the money for. When we look at the procedures, it gets to the anecdotal levels at the school site. It's establishing the specific controls from the onset of cash receipts, cash handling, safeguarding of funds, disbursement of funds, reviewing and reporting. And again, we have established a very appropriate cash management procedure. It's a very deliberate system in place to account for these funds. With our involvement and our oversight, there's increased monitoring and audit review. And of course, as Superintendent, we have mentioned we have an improved system. The Munis allows me to better account for these funds. And more importantly, it allows better transparency and oversight, because I can see what's going on at the school at any given moment. If it's on the system, I can view it. So we're doing routine reviews. There's procedures that govern reconciliation. And I want to say that in the old process, the review was very antiquated, and it was laborious again, and it came to a point where it was borderline untimely. Now with the involvement of the system and the implementation of how we're designing controls, we're getting to a point where there's daily, weekly, monthly reviews. There's cash out processes. And then from my standpoint, my audit team is involved. I mean, we may not be looking at every school on a daily basis, but we are on a quarterly basis. They're reconciled. And each school, we slowly move through the week, accomplishing and reviewing. So there's a good amount of oversight from an audit perspective that goes into timely reconciliation and reviews. The system is designed to have controls, and then the system is designed for us to recognize weaknesses and report deficiencies. So what is the role of internal audit, and really how does that differ from another external auditor? So really, my role as the chief auditor and my audit team's role, it's really a dual purpose. It's not enough for my team to, at the end of the year, come to the superintendent, come to the deputy superintendents, and say, we have deficiencies, and here are your deficiencies. We're different. We're internal. I'm embedded in this process. I'm embedded in the process of reviews. I'm on site. I have daily interactions with the schools, and I have routine visits and reviews of the system. So it's not enough for me to come out and make a report. Rather, we're part of the solutions. So if I identify deficiencies, I'm built into the process to provide solutions, look at risk, make corrective action plans, and make recommendations for operational improvement. So really, we're there, and audit's primary focus is always going to be compliance. We're always going to look at whether the schools are compliant with established rules, regulations, and SOPs. But from our standpoint, it goes a little bit further. There's a little bit more that we have to do. There's value added in an internal audit office by being a part of the solutions. And let me tell you how we do the risk management. Annually, since I've taken the position, we're looking at, not at the end of the year, how schools are reporting. We're looking at the whole system, and we're looking at the schools, each individual schools. We're conducting what's called a variance analysis. And this is simply to look at the bookkeeping function and to track cash. Is cash being accurately reported, and does that reconcile to cash in bank? From that analysis, that stems of what we call our risk-based performance reviews. So from that analysis, we engage on a sample basis in a more thorough performance reviews based on the deficiencies we find. So if we find a deficiency at one middle school and a high school and another elementary school, then we're engaging in a full-blown performance review. That full-blown performance review will cover an analysis of SOPs, internal controls, and compliance to their reports. That will culminate in a thorough report given to the superintendent for his disposition and corrective action. Also, in addition, again, it's not enough that we stop with identifying deficiencies and doing these reports. We're built into the process, as I mentioned earlier, is we are assisting the schools with monthly reconciliations. We're performing quarterly reviews. We conduct the annual audit training. We offer a help desk and assistance. And we do this in a manner where we have to be very careful of how we assist and how we advise and how we train, where we don't impair our independence to audit their school process. So, again, our primary function is compliance, but we have a built-in function to improve system controls, train, and get them to an appropriate level where the cash management is comfortable and risk-adverse. So we look at the audit improvements that's really made, and I know the highlight of the way we're presenting this is we've taken it off of a significant deficiency and moved it to a management letter comment. But really, let me focus in and provide some insight into what is the true audit improvements from my perspective. When I look at the biggest advantage that we have right now is I have a wider scope of review. I can look at the schools real time. The Munis systems allows me to be really on site at their school looking at their books. And it doesn't wait for manual reports to be submitted to my office. I can do that on a daily basis. Again, there's system changes. We're looking at improved system controls. We're looking at transactions daily as they occur and as they happen. We're as good as the system allows us to be, and we're leveraging the system as much as we can. It's a new system. I'm a new auditor. There's a learning curve that goes into really leveraging what we can do with the system, but we're slowly seeing these improvements, and it's really making a huge impact in how we account for cash. Again, the system allows more timely monitoring and reconciliations. From our audit perspective, we run what's called a system help desk, and we have FMIS support for a system help desk. So if you're a school treasurer or an administrator at the school site and your books don't balance or you have questionable issues with documentation or approvals, then we have a desk and a number that you can call at really all hours of operation and get a hold of an auditor who would, one, advise, two, bring it to my attention, and three, more than likely be on site. We conduct what's called our annual NAF trainings. These NAF trainings have been mandatory, and we're getting the right people who touch and have custody over the money to come in and be trained routinely. And we're looking at this. We just completed our annual training the other week, and we're looking at another go-around for sometime later next month. We're looking to schedule that next month. There's increased interaction with the schools. They've come to rely and developed a very good professional working relationship with seeking advice, seeking assistance, and coming to IAO for review of some of their work processes. We're looking at the increased transparency through IAO's website. What we're doing now is not only is we're looking at their system activity, but we're making that public. We published our website, and if you go on there and look under NAF reports, you're going to see on a quarterly basis receipts and disbursements and bank balances for every school that has a non-appropriated fund account. I really firmly believe that, again, accountability and transparency are married. If we can put this information out there, we're going to improve accountability of the funds. We're going to have administrators knowing what amounts of monies they fundraised and tracing that to see what we're reporting publicly, if that made it to the system and if that made it to the bank. There's a higher quality of review. This is evidenced by us working hand in hand and in collaboration with Deloitte. I know that you guys reference, and a lot of the public references, Deloitte's audit, but really that audit stems from the audits of the Internal Audit Office. They utilize our work, they review our work, and they publish our work publicly with the issuance of their financial audit. We're conducting more thorough risk analysis, we're doing that more timely, and then we're engaging in investigative and performance reviews. In the short time that I've been there, 3 years, I've issued 22 non-appropriated funds related audits. These are your systematic sampling audits to your more investigative reviews. Again, there's many improvements, and really what we're looking at now moving forward is the increased awareness and a clear understanding of the importance and the roles of responsibilities of cash management at the school. To really acknowledge that improvement, Deloitte has removed that finding from a significant deficiency into the management letter comment. And let me just explain what that really means, is that the material weaknesses identified, or the materiality of the deficiencies in the non-appropriated funds, has diminished to a point where there's an acceptable level where it's now a reportable condition. So quite simply put, the amount of money that was unquestionable has decreased. The internal controls over accounting for this cash has improved. And then lastly, I want to end with, as much as internal audit, as much as the systems in place, and as much as we have people trained and they understand their roles and responsibilities, I have to end with, cash is the primary source of the money they're handling, and cash has an inherent risk. And even with a perfectly designed system with strong controls and a very effective audit team, if there's malicious intent to deceive or manipulate the system, there's always going to be that risk for misappropriation. And with that said, and that's the critical component of my audit team, is we show up daily. We're looking at the system. We're tracking anomalies. We're looking at variances. And we're identifying risk. And where risk is identified, we're engaging in our reviews. If it looks to be one that's critical, we engage in an investigative review. So sooner or later, we're improving the system such that even though it's cash and there's a high level of risk, it's going to be a tolerable risk, and we're going to be able to, hopefully, I would say, identify and get to a point where if things are not properly accounted for, there's going to be questions drawn. And that's what we do. We really are diligent in our process. We examine the system as a whole, and we go at it with, again, a routine review. And that's how we're going to improve the cash management.
Thank you, Mr. Gubernors. And I welcome you to the Department of Education, but I've got 3 simple questions.
Sure.
And maybe you'll be able to answer it, or the superintendent, or one of the deputy superintendent. 41 SOPs exist today, correct? 41 schools?
40.
40?
One school. There's currently 40. One elementary school does not elect to use the non-appropriated funds. What we're seeing is some of them are removing the responsibilities to account for cash and transferring cash management to the PTOs.
You're saying one school does not have, and which school is it?
Off the top of my head, I believe it's Machinao now.
Machinao?
Yes.
They don't do any fundraisers, right?
No. Just the PTO will take care of it.
Right. So at the elementary school level, I mean, also secondary, but in the elementary school level, you'll see a very active PTO that also is responsible for fundraising for that for their activities, and that is not covered by departmental or internal audit responsibilities. They're separate, technically separate organizations. So,
okay.
But they are active at the school level.
Okay. The only reason I'm concerned about is that when PTOs do any fundraisers, it's for the school, it's for the students, and I know they're registered. They're supposed to be registered with Department of Revenue and Tax. And just a reminder, I know Ms. Gutierrez, and I like to, Mr. Chairman disappeared, but we have board member James Juan. But when I was with the board, I was also working with Revenue and Tax, and we were able to kind of made every effort to fix every school on their PTOs. A lot of them are not up to date, and I'm only concerned they're not up to date with Revenue and Tax. I'm concerned that they're conducting fundraisers for or in the campus, and they may not have chosen, but as long as I don't know, this is just my belief, and maybe the superintendent can echo the same thing. If they say they're a DOE school, they got to fall under the umbrella of the DOE restrictions and control, because most PTOs have principals involved, have a bunch of the staff involved, and I don't know how can a PTO actually say, I don't want to get involved with your NAF. It just doesn't work that easy. I mean, I can understand if you said in Machinano, which is in Dedidu, you can say your Machinano community non-profit organization, and they can say they're going to give money to Machinano Elementary, but you can't say you're Machinano Elementary School, and then you're not going to put, no, it doesn't work that way. That's, John, maybe you can.
Yes. So first of all, and then you're very well aware of these issues, in your role at Revenue Tax, but also, as you remember, in the past several years, I'm not sure if it happened this past year while I was away, but we typically pull in all of the PTO presidents and officers, as on once a year, or at least more than once a year, but at least once a year, to focus on exactly the issues you've raised with regard to their compliance, with regard to, especially with regard to registration with Revenue Tax and following the rules with regard to fundraising and reporting of their financial condition. And so I'll say a couple of things. Number one, we're very thankful for those volunteers, which include parents as well as school employees, as well who participate in PTOs. I know our former members are also active with PTOs or in their past experiences. But so we support them because they do support the schools in many ways. And one of the challenges is ensuring on a regular basis that they understand their roles, responsibilities as members of technically and legally independent nonprofit organizations. And so that thing we have to continue to work on, and you're well aware of our efforts to try to make sure. And some of our PTO officers will come in and say, we don't want to touch the old accounts, we want to audit, we want to figure out how we're going to move forward. All of that has to continue. Simply moving the fundraising responsibilities to the PTO, is not enough. We need to make sure that they're functioning appropriately. And so that technical assistance from the department has to continue. And I want to thank you because you also have come in many times to present and give them that advice. So thank you for that. The second issue is that this is under discussion, but it is it's a challenge. I mean, so technically and legally, these are independent organizations, but as we've discussed internally, it doesn't shield us from all responsibility because we facilitate those activities on our school grounds. And because of that facilitation, we have to very carefully look at how we conduct oversight and how we manage that. And it's a challenge in a number of ways. Number one is, yes, we do want our administrators to have a level of involvement and visibility into the PTO activities and fundraising, because they have to approve those activities as well. I mean, if the principal doesn't allow you to do those activities, especially at the school site, they shouldn't be done. So there's a level so we have to, we do have to be clear, and I think that's something we need to work on, the clarity about that relationship between the administrator and the PTOs. The other issue, I know as we've been approached in the past, especially with the Internal Audit Office talking about NAF, are you auditing the PTOs? And we are not auditing the PTOs, nor does the external auditor have that expectation that we are going to audit these separate, legally, technically, independent organizations. But we do have to figure out some level of verification that they're properly and responsibly operating. So, trying to figure out that mechanism is something that we have to try to determine. Already our audit office is strapped just to take care of all the existing, 65 and 900 sub-accounts. They already are strapped just trying to deal with what exists. Then you add to that all the PTOs that exist as well, and that's another set of work. So workload, responsibility, accountability, we still have to struggle with that. Right now, though, the audit performance does not reflect the activities of these separate organizations. But this is active discussion. We've been talking about how do we do that, and what's our role, what's our legal, technical role, and what are those mechanisms?
We'll figure that out very soon when I get a hold of Department of Revenue and Tax. Ms. Gutierrez, I saw you waving your hand, so I know you want to speak. Go ahead.
Senator, although I wave my, talking to Mr. Mendiola, but when you mention about PTA, that's very dear to my heart. And I know that I asked you, I think last year, to appear, to come and meet with all. I'm not a parent rep on the board, but I did talk to Mr. Mendiola, since he's the parent rep, that at the time, there were so many questions about from some officers of the PTO regarding transition of from one office to officers to another, and that's why I ask you and Mr. Joe Gutierrez, no relation, that if you can please meet with the PTO officers, and thank you for that. But even with that, I also communicate with Mr. Cooperners, but I could say the DOE cannot audit the PTOs. And they told them that, you have any question, you need to really go up to Revenue and Tax. Because it's true, Senator, some of them are not registered. They've been doing fundraising and they're not registered. And I told them, I said, if you get audited, you're really going to be in trouble by Revenue and Tax. And my concern too there is this: a lot of these officers on the PTOs, especially that are treasurer, are employees of DOE. And, so that's, I think, from here, as a senator, maybe you should, I highly recommend that do something about it, but from the department, they really can, just like the uniform contract, there really is the PTO that handles the uniform contract, not the department. So, it's just, but I just wanted to touch that based on that because you brought that up. But I have spoken to Mr. Mendiola, that has the parent rep, because for a while, they were not really, their quarterly meeting or whatever had stopped. So Mr. Mendiola, who is a former PTO president of Audit, and I think still an officer, I know he's going to continue reaching out to those PTO. Thank you.
Mark, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I know Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Castro, mentioned that I guess he also served as a PTO for Untitled Middle School, and he was talking about I think it was called a parent congress, where we can kind of put some I guess organization to all the presidents within the PTO, because here in my experience, the transition from one PTO organization to the next, there's often gaps there. But I do know, my last past president of Agustin Johnson Middle School, we ensured that we were in compliance with rev and tax, submitting the proper documentation. But I think that is something that we can definitely look at in terms of, ensuring that the department puts that onus on, because as Superintendent Fernandez mentioned, we all share in that responsibility. They're using the school's names to basically raise funds. And so I think it would be prudent on our part to also put some sort of requirement that in order for them to continue as a PTO organization, they have to have their documents, and they're going to be considered a nonprofit, duly registered nonprofit organization. Before they start raising money for the school year, they need to come in and make sure that they provide the documentation to the administration so that they can verify that. With respect to the audits of these PTOs, I do know that we have our treasurer's report and report out to the body, the transactions that have occurred. But I think it be prudent on our part to also add a mechanism in there where they can also, documents can be inspected in terms of their expenditures and the revenues that are generated. So I understand there may be some gaps with the PTO, but in terms of the non-appropriated funds that we're here to discuss, I think it's very important that we as a board look at the existing policies, and of course when the department comes back with their recommendations to strengthen these policies, as our chief auditor mentioned, when there's cash involved, there's always inherent risk. It's how do you minimize that risk? How do you mitigate that risk? So I think that's the key here that we definitely want to let the community know and let you senators know. I mean, it's a substantial amount of money that these students raise, and it's kind of disheartening when you find out that fraud has occurred, or but people tend to try and go around the system to do certain things. But if we catch it, how do we recover those funds, and how do we move forward? So with that, Senator, I just want to say that I do know, working with the superintendent and perhaps maybe even with a colleague and with your help at Rev and Tax, that we can tighten up the internal controls within the PTOs.
Well, I can assure you, Mr. Mendiola and Mr. Chairs, and even the superintendent, that I will be talking to Revenue and Tax. A real quick reminder, like Mr. Chairs brought up, I was with the Department of Revenue and Tax, and the Department of Revenue and Tax has been backwards. I mean, I think that we pretty much almost flipped over, several times for several years with the PTOs for the Department of Education. And while the people of Guam are listening on to this, it's going to reach a point where the department is not going to bend no more. While I was on the board, I think I did a workshop every year. When I wasn't on the board, I still was called to do workshop. And I was working for the Criminal Investigation Branch. And we were, the department has made every effort. I know that. I know that they're ready at the tax enforcement administrator is ready. He wants to start closing down the PTOs. Enough's enough after 10 years. And that's why I'm very concerned that the PTOs has got to have some strong connection or hands tight with the department, because they can't just keep doing this. And understanding that out of 41 schools, I would not hesitate to state that not even half of that is fully in compliance. I'm not going to confirm that today, but that's not hard to confirm. And if you're saying you got about $2 to $2 million in the non-appropriate with the schools, there should be very close to maybe $2 million floating out there at the PTOs. And I'm just concerned that there are vendors out there that are donating, but not to go to the PTOs. We'll get back to first just the schools.
I could just, but I think what you're saying, but we definitely will raise that. And over the last 3 or 4 years, as we've done these workshops, what we recognize is that if it were just the same people we were training every year, we would expect that we would see improvements. And there are some PTOs that are stable, But we often find that when we come in after the summer, it's a new set of officers who run for the PTO because they want to support their kids and they want to support their school, and they're very active and they have very good intentions, but a lot of these expectations may not be clear to them, and they'll spend the first 3 or 4 months just figuring that out. Right, not just rev and tax, but how to make sure they set up the bank account, change the signature cards, and all of that. So I do think that we will, as we see these transitions happening, focusing on that transition is going to be, something we will put on our priority list, just to ensure that, that they understand the rules, the requirements, where to go for technical assistance with rev and tax or the department, but also just to help them too, because I think they come in with good intentions. I mean, we're saying that even if we look at compliance issues, most of them start off saying we want to help, but trying to get to all the check marks on the list that they need to do to properly operate, that's sometimes they just jump in and then they figure out they have all these rules that they need to figure out and follow, and however we can smooth that out, we're willing to work with you on that.
I'll work with the Department of Tax, which we happen to also oversee, so that'll be something we can figure that out real quick.
If I can just add a quick comment relative to the discussion of the PTOs. Again, in the short time period that I've been with GDOE, I had a lot of concerns. We run a hotline. I've had several people visit me over the concerns with the PTO and the management of that cash. I also had several discussions with Mrs. Gutierrez, and she actually requested that internal audit provide some type of advisory and guidance to the school sites on how PTOs should be formulated, best practices for cash management, and their regulatory requirements. So we did that. We issued a advisory which is posted on our website, and that's really the best practices procedures. It's kind of standardized, and it follows how they have to be incorporated in cash management reporting and filing.
All right. Getting back to what we're here for the roundtable. Internal audit. When was that office established? 2014?
No, internal audit has been long-standing, but I think when I arrived, we were at 3 employees, and then it reduced to 2, and maybe I think 2 at that point. And at that point, the primary responsibility was NAF. And so, in coming in and looking at the issues that we were having with our high-risk status and all of the work that we were going through to comply, we determined that having a strong internal audit function would be a key part of trying to get off of high risk, because it would be an opportunity for us to not, to police ourselves and monitor our compliance, and to correct any deficiencies in a proactive manner. So now we're up to, was it 6? 6 employees in the internal audit office. Over the last 3 years we've built up. And it started with hiring Mr. Cooper Nurse as chief auditor, and then saying that we're going to ramp up your activity, so it's no longer just focused on NAF, although it's a big responsibility. Now you've got to assist us with helping us to identify all the issues that we see with regard to our comprehensive corrective action plan with the Fed. So they have a bigger scope of work, but NAF still is a big workload that they do cover, and that's where we're at right now.
So would it be safe to say that, when did you come on board, Chief?
3 years ago,
2014. So you wrote the last report then at OPA, right? Pretty much? Or you were familiar with it? What I wanted to get at is, the next one is, when did the training really kick off for all the administrators, the folks at the school that should know what they should be doing, so that we wouldn't have had the incident we had at Agustin or any other school, maybe Simon Sanchez, 2009. Unfortunately, the former principal's not here, because I was going to ask her a question about it, but I'm only concerned about that because in reference to the training, are there any internal control checklists that every principal needs to check off? Like, you do it quarterly, only because I'm retired from the military, and I'm very familiar that the federal government does this a lot. I know that GovCom doesn't do it, but I honestly believe the DOE needs to establish an internal control checklist that says, every quarterly, the principal goes around and says, is all my NAF accounted for? Has all transactions, because as I look at all your OPA reports, it always talks about money was received or money was paid, but there's no receipt.
Yes.
You know, you got at the schools, you've got inventory of books. The principal checkoff said that he checked all the classroom, made sure that all the air conditioners are running, so that the board is not trying to all of a sudden come to a board meeting and find out that there's $5 million worth of deficiency at the schools. You know, a checklist that the superintendent can turn to quarterly and says, or turn to, unfortunately, Chris, probably Anderson, probably end up be the one looking at it, or Erica, but be looking at it and be saying that everything is being accounted for. Because part of this NAF, and you mentioned you have the SAF and you've got the TAF. And on the SAF, you identified you have 525, 25 and 534 accounts.
Correct.
Are we talking about like the chess club? Like
Yes.
Those are the different accounts.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yes,
those are the subledgers, right? And on the TAF,
Student clubs.
what are the TAF we're talking about? You got 40 of them.
Those are generally administrative fees, wet garbage fees, admin fund, 5K, and then it's used to facilitate the transfer of SAF at the end of the year into TAF.
So would it be safe to say today there's no internal control checklist that you could turn to? I mean, not just going to the Munis program, because I know the board members would love to see that there is some sense of control.
Absolutely.
Because the board, I mean, I did that for 6 years. We're running around trying to figure out what board policy to update. And then after we update it, the superintendent is running around to find out, is anybody really in control? Thank God, you have a bunch of deputy superintendents that can get into it, but it'll drown you. I know that Erica's probably like, I got 40 schools, I got to go chasing. After I fix one, the other NAF account, and I was going to bring it up to that. On the last OPA report, you have Finnegan, Marisu, PC, Weddingdale, George Washington, John F. Kennedy, Ocean View, Ukidu, and Simon Sanchez. I'm concerned more, before we even discuss those schools that are listed in the OPA, that there's questionable transaction on the NAF. Did the department recover the money that was stolen at Simon Sanchez in 2009? All the money? I'd be curious to know, and that's why I was hoping that the board member, the former principal, would answer that. You know, it's something.
So my understanding of that situation, although it happened several years ago, I know there was a recent decision by a court ordering restitution of, I believe the amount was $2,000 to go back to Simon Sanchez. So we did go recently to verify whether all of that amount was paid, and we did verify that that $2,000 was repaid to the department.
Okay, but how much was totally stolen? Was it 8,000 or something? Wasn't it in the tens of thousands? I mean, it crippled the whole graduation of Simon Sanchez. And I'm just concerned that, I'm very concerned that on the NAF account, if somebody steals, you wait for the court action. You have an attorney, right, at the DOE. You're waiting for the court action, but why isn't there a suit being followed by the department to recover everything? Because I wouldn't be surprised if everybody that's on this table has donated, and you're seeing your money just go to waste. And the students' money is going to waste. The donors, people that are donating, there's nobody trying to recover everything. And that, I don't want the department to be in that position where you're suing all the time, but there's got to be some legal action, not just. I know it's time consuming.
Right. So I know that recently we've been looking at restitution as a mechanism. So through the courts, to when someone is found and convicted, that restitution be a part of the penalty. Whether that's going to repay all the amount. I mean, Simon Sanchez, even though I don't have the direct amounts of it, all of it's just from what I've learned. It was an amount much more significant than the $2,000 in restitution that was provided. But I do like before maybe Mr. Cooper will want to talk about the controls that are in place at the school level. I do want to say that again, one of the things that is really important to clarify is that with an improved system, with an audit function, it doesn't mean that we now see lower issues at the schools. We actually will see more because we have more visibility, more monitoring. So that's actually a good thing that we're now able to see throughout the school system where there might be an issue. And then the second issue is that when you see reports, whether it's the audit reports or internal reconciliation issues, when you see a flag, it doesn't necessarily mean there's abuse or theft. A lot of what I know that Frank is finding is it's just, some of that's the basic accounting is support that needs to happen. So a lot of it's reconciliation. So their first level of effort is, number one, making sure they have all the documentation. Like, schools, we're seeing that things are not matching up. Do you have the proper documentation so you can make sure your accounts match? Number two, are you regularly and timely reviewing the bank statements, comparing to your Munis account, and so forth? And then the third thing is, a lot of it is, once we establish that you have all the information, the reconciliation process to make sure that, some of it is just that I know that he can talk about, when he deals with certain schools, sometimes he'll just have to go back in time and reconstruct, what the ins and the inputs and outputs from these accounts just to see that they add up. And you may find that they add up. You may find that they add up, but he has to do all that work to try to get to that solution. And what we're trying to do is avoid that, just improve the accounting so that we can. And then, but what happens that if he sees but so despite all this work and investigation that we cannot account for a particular amount, that's when it raises to the level of something other than a reconciliation and accounting issue is a problem. And that's when, if there's potential criminal activity, we are required to go to law enforcement, report that, and then report it up the chain for those concerns. When you want to talk about internal controls, he can address some of that.
With you, Chief, you got a new system, Mr. Superintendent. I'm concerned is there something in the system that mechanized that says that quarterly, if you don't update and reconcile, and it's not put in the system basically like shuts them down and sends a red flag to you saying the following schools have not done reconciliation. They have not. They have, regardless if they had a fundraiser or not in the quarter, but something that kind of like flags their account. They can't do anything. They can't draw money. They can't. It kind of like ties them up. And the reason why I'm concerned about that is because under the rules and regulation of, I'm almost sure, DOE's rules and regulation deals with personnel is the same as DOA. You got 60 days.
Yes.
I honestly believe in the first 30 days of any investigation is when you could have, should have, and must have been informed, okay, that an action was committed, okay, to lead to adverse action. And I'm only concerned is that as things, if they're not flagged in a quarterly, you'll miss it. They'll go to civil service and they'll win, and the people of Guam are going to say, another screw up.
Absolutely.
And I'm just saying, I know that you guys can set up the system where, even if it has to be 60 days, and the reason why, because I know the board members are looking for action. They want positive results. I've never wanted negative results. I would love to see DOE promote all the good, because you have a lot of good things going on in DOE. Unfortunately, NAF now is not a pretty sight. That's why I called for the roundtable with my vice chair, is that we want to just resolve this. I want to assure the people of Guam that you guys have control. And I honestly believe you do. It's just that didn't have enough time to do it yet, but I'm just concerned. I'd like to find out if there's anything in the system so that hopefully on a quarterly basis, the board members will receive a report saying, yes, everybody's in, every school is accounted for. If like this OPA report says, wow, amazing, I'll use Marisa for example. They got $5,780, cash per bank, $1,373, variance of $4,407. Wow, that's a big variance. I can imagine what does the other schools look like. And imagine the kids, the students, parents, and the vendors that are saying, I'm going to give you. And you got variants of that. I mean, you've got one here that's John F. Kennedy. I'm looking at, this is 2014 OPA report. 67,000 on the book, 68,000 in the bank. A variance of negative 1,184. Yeah. Ooh, I don't want to go into too much detail of everything. I just wanted to let you know that we are aware of this at the legislature. The people of Guam are not. They're not aware that, I mean, if I keep going down, another school, who can do 24,000 variance? Hello? That's somebody's salary, annual salary.
Sure.
But, I'll let my vice chair ask his questions.
Did you want me, can I comment?
Can I say something really quickly? I know it, especially when you're fundraising, as a fundraiser, myself, it's that it erodes the confidence in the public, the trust. So the system and the mechanisms that in place, and since coming on the board, I had the and Mr. Cooper's here will be able to share the process, because I asked the same thing, from start to finish. When the money's come in, how are they accounted for? So I know that the department has that, but when someone tries to defraud or starts to do something criminal, it's when you catch it and how you deal with it. But I think you made a very valid point, Mr. Chairman, that I think the recovery, especially when we lose funds, perhaps maybe legislation can be put in there where it enables the department to go above and beyond just the criminal, letting it work through the criminal. If that person's found guilty, then how can we get that restitution? Because there is a huge gap. If $10,000 was stolen and only $2,000 was required for them to pay that, what about the other $8,000 that needs to go back? How do you make these student organizations or these people who raise money, how do you make them whole? And in addition to that, then there's things that are encumbered, especially when vendors come and say, you know what, we need to get paid for the services that were rendered. You mentioned a graduation. And if you look at the policy, it specifically states that once a year is over, whatever money is not expended then gets transferred over into, is it called the TAF, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the TAF, where, but when they take that money and it's defrauded from the students, sometimes you're left to, there's a lot of people affected by that criminal activity or that enterprise. So I guess what I'm asking is, perhaps maybe the legislature may be able to help us to, after the fact, after all we have our internal procedures and stuff, and if something is found, that we were able to go out there and seek more restitution than what the court has perhaps, mentioned. And so I just want to leave that out there, that perhaps that might be beneficial, that it gives a little bit more teeth for the department to recover the full amount that was actually taken from the students.
Well, maybe something that we may, I'll be speaking with Senator Wilt on that one, is that maybe we can consider legislation across the board to GovGuam to change maybe that if you're a GovGuam employee and you steal from the government and it's during the time of your service and you retire, maybe it can be similar to the military. In the military, when you retire and they find out that you committed a crime during your service, they pull you back to active duty and they take away your retirement. They actually make you pay for everything. And maybe that may be something that Senator Castro and I could look at and take a look at how we may want to go down that road, because there has been a lot of activities, not only at DOE, but across the board in Guam. And there needs to be some recovery. The people of Guam, which pays for GovGuam, needs to at least feel that there's going to be some accountability. People will be held accountable, and then we can move on from there. Senator Castro.
If I can just respond to the questions that you posed earlier. One of them was the system controls. Do we have system controls that will flag if these reconciliations aren't done, if they're not on the system, and if they're not reviewed? And the question is, there's a variety of ways we flag them. And the simple answer is, are they being flagged? Absolutely, they're being flagged. When we look at the schools who are missing documentation, who are not timely reporting, and who do not perform their routine cash outs, we're able to flag them. Not only are we able to flag them, we're able to publicly post that on our website. So if you see what we're able to do with the system, yes, to answer your question, they're being flagged. There's transparency in that process. It's being put on our website of what are the deficiencies we identified. And then to take it further, we're improving system controls where the system can identify timeliness. If you're off the system, if you're not cashed out at a certain day, you're not reconciled, we're going to start sending system-generated reports that says you're this number of days outstanding. So we're going to get a little bit more proactive in taking these measures. And then to your earlier comment, you asked if there is a specific checklist that is guided at the school level to ensure compliance. And what I can say is, and I can't answer for the school level, but absolutely there is specific procedures. And while I can't answer for the school side, I can answer for what we look at in our review in our office. And is there a checklist? There's what we call an audit program. And that goes through, and it's very similar to a checklist where it's a compliance measurement tool where we're looking at areas of procedures and compliance to that. So it's not per se a checklist, but there is compliance components that's laid out in terms of procedures, and we go through that and examine whether or not they appropriately complied. And then the last thing, in the reference to the OPA reports that you're citing, I just wanted to clarify that that's DOE's reports, and that's issued through Deloitte and made publicly available for consumption through the OPA. So those identified deficiencies and those identified weaknesses with NAF is coming from this office, and it's acted upon by this office. So what you're seeing in 2014, if you take it current, you're going to see action taken upon those schools, and you're not going to see the same. What I'm seeing now, and for lack of a better comparison, is it's like a whack-a-mole effect. The more I see risk in one school, I place more emphasis in an auditor. Other risk areas arise. So it's really, again, getting the intimacy of the system, getting it down, and getting the awareness out and improving the controls. And we're at that point. So that's to answer your question, yes. And those deficiencies have been looked at, identified by our office, accordingly responded, and to bring it current, I can speak to the current state of those affairs in terms of deficiencies.
Then maybe hopefully DOE can publish that on their website saying all the schools, put the amount, and then
right.
It's kind of like letting the people of Guam know.
So I believe on the website there is an update of the quarterly accounts. So, well, I mean, again, like you said, as you know, when you implement a system and then you build everyone's familiarity and you go forward, then it ends up providing your next set of questions that you need to answer. So right now, our next set of questions is, okay, so Frank is able to look and flag schools now across the system on a regular basis. Now, what do we do with that information, right? So part of it is getting information from the schools, supporting them to do the reconciliations. Do they need technical assistance training? All of that piece. The other piece is, look, there's non-compliance and repeat non-compliance. That becomes an administrative issue with the principal. So, doing all of that, that's become the next set of, okay, we've got to take action to strengthen our system and making sure that accountability works. I know Mr. Anderson, was referencing in our earlier conversation, we have all the individual SOPs that the schools, is that sufficient? Do we need to review them and and look at the overlap and consistency of these SOPs and formulate some uniform guidance from central office to say, either adopt this standard SOP or adopt these main provisions in the SOPs, because we know that some schools are different in nature and they might have different little provisions, but at the essential components need to be in place. So I think that discussion, board policy would have to be adjusted, because it's school level responsibility, but that's where we're at now. And so what you're flagging is now we have all the information. So what's next? And that's where we gotta strengthen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you're all aware, the chairman called this roundtable primarily because it was motivated by allegations of criminal intent at one or more schools, and so I'm glad you're able to address that to some extent. I got to tell you, for the record, Mr. Superintendent and board members, that my level of confidence relative to the NAF has been heightened, has increased, given your testimony and given the systemic changes that have occurred in your administration, Mr. Superintendent. I can remember when the chairman was the chair of the board and Mrs. Gutierrez was a member and I was the chief planner, and then you had Lester Kuykendall. Does that name ring a bell? And boy, he was so frustrated because, at the time, the NAF was like the three-letter bad word of the department. Nobody wanted to talk about it because we couldn't put our arms around that challenge. And I can see and I can hear that you made major improvements systematically and systemically. I do have some questions. Most of them have been answered by both your testimony and by Mr. Mendiola. But, it's important for me. I prefer to have these discussions maybe in like a conference room where we can actually work through this to see how lawmakers can fashion public policy to aid you folks in shoring up the public's trust for these monies. So it's a process of continued improvement. I think we know that. So please see this as as our effort to establish a working partnership, and maybe less public recordations of these types of discussions and more work session related. Again, this was motivated primarily about the allegations of mishandling of funds, which I'll get into when the chairman returns. I do have some follow-up questions. Any one of you can answer. Of the $2 million generated, how much do you suspect falls through the cracks in terms of whether it's an error in accounting standards, or we're talking minor errors, right, in terms of maybe not reporting on time, versus suspected criminal activity?
So that number, again, that's the on-the-book balance. And the on-the-book balance is only as good as what the school records. When we're looking at cash is always at risk. And I had this conversation with the superintendent. It's hard to put a number on how much cash doesn't get reported, right? So you have activities, and these are fundraising activities, and that's really where our risk is at. And, you know, as an auditor, I don't want to expose where our risk is at. But to discuss this, because we're trying to bring better transparency, and we're going to have a dedicated focus to mitigate these risks. But to look at the fundraising activities that happen on a Friday evening, on a Saturday, when it has to do with interscholastics and sporting games or some fundraising events that go through the weekend, and there isn't a business office that's readily available to bring that cash to. So that's where there is really heightened risk of, we're really looking at the integrity of the process. Have we established controls? Yes. I mean, from the cash standpoint, the advisors and the students have to have a cash count report. That cash count report has to flow to the business office. The business office has to receipt the cash, and they have to do it in the form that we've prescribed that counts the denomination, the club, and the fund that it's going to. They maintain their subledgers, and then they input it into the munis, and we kind of reconcile that against the bank. But again, the weakness and the risk is of what gets into the system.
If I could add, I mean, and again, this is an issue that would affect all organizations who deal with cash. But you know, the thing about it is, once it hits the system, we feel that we have the system in place to track and identify issues. The gap between someone collecting cash and reporting it in and handing it over, you know, so like, you know, if something happens over the weekend, you know, that's something that's almost invisible to us without further types of work, you know, at the school level. But if it hits the system, we'll see it. The issue is, I mean, we've got to think through those types of approaches. Now, you know, having participated in fundraising for an organization at a school for my daughter, we know that the teachers are working hard to figure out what the budget is for this activity. They set out fundraising events to try to hit that budget. It's almost relying on the parent to check in and make sure, how far are we? How much are you recording of my account for, you know, my student that we've raised? There's a lot that happens on that front end, but as soon as cash hits, we're expecting it to go into the account. But what I think Frank's saying is that we're only as good as the people who are collecting that cash, you know, in that gap between collecting and handing it over.
And without getting too deep in the weeds in terms of how to mitigate that, maybe just a couple follow-up questions. Are certain schools, you had a follow-up comment, Frank?
Yeah, if I can just add a follow-up comment relative to the cash, because there is audit procedures that would identify and mitigate that risk, right? So relative to a recent event, which was the FastPack activities where we housed delegates, we opened student stores, and there was a big influx of cash during that 2-week period. So again, we're looking at procedures to try to identify those and mitigate those risks. What we did, and what's a common audit procedure for auditing cash, is we did surprise cash counts. And that proved to be effective because we went to the schools and we visited a different school daily, and we were able to reconcile and look at their cash count sheets in their banks. So that audit ended up being pretty clean in terms of cash management.
Would you say that certain schools are at greater risk than others? You know, and again, I'm not having been a school administrator, we have one here. You know, do high schools obviously, I mean, it sounds like it's an obvious question, but I want to establish this as a matter of record. Do high schools generate more money than middle schools and elementary, or is it the reverse because of greater parental participation? and I just learned something that I mean, it's almost common sense, but it's worth asking. Some schools are a little more active in raising money than others. And can you speak to that?
Sure, absolutely. So are some schools at greater risk? So the greater volume, the greater the risk. And like you said, the high schools really take up majority of the fundraising efforts, and they have the bulk of all the cash that's handled at the schools. And then to address the question of are some schools at more risk than other schools? And really, that's a kind of a complex answer. And like I alluded to earlier, I see pockets of risk. I identify and mitigate, and I see other pockets grow. So what makes a school more at risk? You could have a new treasurer, a new AA, a new administrator, and you can have deficiencies in their capacity to handle cash. That's where the involvement, the oversight, and the training is involved to get them up to speed. So yes, there's a lot more volume in the high school. With the volume of cash being placed at the high school, there's more risk. And then what entails that risk, and are some schools at higher risk? The schools with newer people, the schools who weren't properly trained, and schools who have known to be past efficient with NAF handling.
Another question. Earlier it was mentioned that there are 40 to 41 separate SOPs. Could you speak to this?
Yes. So with the policy directive of 715, the board policy, it really mandated the school. The administrator is sole custodian and is solely responsible for the safeguarding, the accountability, and the reporting of this cash. As such, each school developed its SOP. Again, I'm fairly new to the department. One of the things that I'm doing is I'm doing a sweeping review of all these SOPs. And while there's different SOPs at different schools, there's a lot of similarities in what they're doing because they're doing the same function. They're accounting for cash. So it may vary a little bit from elementary, middle to high, but essentially it's the same function. It's a control for cash management. So what we're trying to do now, and as I mentioned earlier, is we have our own SOP. We're doing a sweeping review of these SOPs, and we're going to try to generate one that's blanket that can be used universally throughout the schools.
I want to commend you for that. I think that's where I was driving to. I know the superintendent mentioned that he wants something perhaps more systemic. You know, a standard question would be, I'm new. Is there a handbook I can get somewhere that says these are the minimal requirements in handling cash? And I don't expect you to respond to that. I kind of got it from your earlier comment, and I appreciate that. Couple more questions, Mr. Chair, and then I'll be happy to turn it back to you or to members from DOE for any other comments. Let's go ahead and shift gears maybe from the discussion on NAF holistically and, you know, at the district level. For my edification, let's discuss law and public policy surrounding criminal activity at the department. So how, let's say in this case, without naming the players in the school, I stumbled upon the mishandling of funds and becomes reported to me. Walk me through the process in terms of who needs to know, when, and under what conditions. In the context of NAF.
Well, I think the issue is if there is an allegation of misconduct, criminal or administrative misconduct, we need that to be reported. So I'm not saying if you're talking outside the system or inside the system, but at any rate, it needs to be reported to management or even to the central office regarding, because sometimes we'll get parents or people calling in, or to the hotline to the audit office with regard to misconduct. It requires, you know, that the person, well, I'll talk to Frank about how this is handled through his office, but, you know, we typically, for us to investigate, we need specifics. We need dates, times, specific allegations, not just, you know, there's someone stealing money. And we would want to know who are you talking about, what school, what amount, was there a particular event, incident, did you witness something? In order for us to be able to properly conduct an investigation. Otherwise, if it's a tip, we'll figure out if we can, you know, make heads or tails out of it so we can properly pursue it. I know audit gets hotline, and they may get anonymous or not accounts, and you can talk about that. If it's about, we don't have enough money, or, we tried to get funding from our account, but the school's telling us no, that might be more of a reconciliation issue. So we would basically want to do our due diligence on, maybe there's a miscommunication or something's going on administratively that just, that just can be easily resolved. So I just want to say there's a difference between saying, numbers don't add up, to we can't explain it through that method. There's some misconduct potential misconduct is present, and we need to pursue that. And then we would go both to the law enforcement route and to the administrative route for investigation. And I don't know if Frank want to talk about, because there's a hotline for internal audit that they also make available to the public.
I'm sorry, can you go ahead and repeat the question so I'm sure how to respond?
The question, okay, so the question was, if there's an allegation of suspected criminal activity and it gets to you, so I pick up the phone and say, hey, I believe $8,000 was stolen from Xavier High School, hypothetically. Okay. How do we handle that, and at what point do you determine, or does the department determine that it should be reported to the Guam Police Department, as an example?
Certainly. So in the case of NAF, if there's any allegation of 1, mishandling, 2, misuse, or 3, misappropriation, it needs to be immediately reported to my office. Chances are I can see it, and hopefully I'll work with the school real time, but if I can't and the school has a better heartbeat on the situation, it needs to be reported to my office. There's several ways, like the superintendent alluded to contact us. Some people want to remain anonymous. They're scared of retaliation. We've established a hotline. They can directly call me. They can walk into the office and submit a report. But it should be reported to us timely. And then what is the disposition? If there's an allegation of mishandling, misuse, or misappropriation, we investigate that matter. We gather the appropriate audit evidence to support our conclusions and validate whether or not this is truly mishandling or there's a malice and criminal intent to misappropriate. So in many of the cases, in examining these shortages and what our audits call to play, where there's some bank shortages, and we alluded to Simon Sanchez, and we alluded to Okadu and Antalon, what we've done is we've done a thorough audit of the accounts, going into each transaction, and we were able to correct accounting processes, deficiencies, to better balance their books. And the question will become, so when we look at a concern and we're saying that, oh, Simon Sanchez is now $8,000 in the red, they're short, and what did audit do about it? And first of all, we identified that deficiency if you're seeing it publicly. Secondly, what did we do about it is we'll investigate that matter, and like in the case of Simon Sanchez specifically, the way they recorded cash over and double stated it. So going back to the accounting structure of the SAF, and you have student organization 1, student organization 2, when they were in receipt of cash, let's say it's a volleyball team that wants to help a graduating class. They had extra fundraising money and they want to transfer it. What they did was they receipted the cash from one club and then made a cash transfer in the ledger of another club. This is the Simon Sanchez situation. What that did was it double stated the receipts. Therefore, it didn't reconcile. There wasn't truly a double statement of cash. It was a double recordation of the cash, and it didn't reflect the bank statements. So there's those areas. When does it get reported to the official external authorities and law enforcement? The board policy and our procedures are very clearly stated in the event and the determination of loss. So when we look at that, in the case of Simon Sanchez, when we do the accounting and we're able to isolate and reconcile and say, this looks like an accounting error, mishandling, versus we look at a situation that's relative to similar like Agustin and past Simon Sanchez, where there's money that eventually looks like it appears to be lost, misappropriated. That's the determining data when we take action to report externally.
And one more statement, follow-up question to that, Mr. Superintendent. Is there a stipulated internal control mechanism that governs this? For example, is there a time frame, 15 days upon receipt of notification? your office must act in accordance with, procedure A through F, et cetera, and then up to the superintendent, then to the board members, and then perhaps to the respective law enforcement authorities?
In terms of a stipulated time to respond to an allegation, no. But we are on top of this timely depending on the risk. What internal audit has done is complied with the stipulated timeline for the administrative remedies. So we fit our report and our investigation to ensure that if it's evidence that the mishandling and the misappropriation occurred, that we fit it into the administrative guideline, which is the 60 days.
So on a criminal matter, for instance, I mean, again, the earliest we detect the potential, I mean, it's not even, substantial evidence, not even a preponderance. If we detect that a criminal activity has occurred, it goes immediately to law enforcement, and that will happen. So, if it's happening at the school level, the administrator who detects criminal activity is required to go to criminal enforcement. Failure to do that is is failing to fulfill that responsibility. So, in our case, when you come to a situation and you go through the reconciliation process, and then you determine something is not adding up, and we've done all the necessary due diligence on it, and the only explanation is potential criminal, then it goes right to law enforcement, and we'll inform others when that becomes. But the report goes directly so that we ensure that we don't lose time in reporting. So that's, and that, again with that's specifically with regard to criminal activity.
And Mr. Chairman, just a couple follow-up questions, and I'll turn it back to you. It was mentioned earlier in the case of Simon Sanchez as an example, the $2,000 restitution for $10,000 to $30,000 of embezzlement or whatever that situation was is hardly justice. Are these individuals who are tied to this mishandling, misappropriation, do they remain employed with the department?
Simon Sanchez?
In that specific case? He's not, okay. And perhaps, and that's why I'm encouraging, again, the department. So our interest, just so we're clear, aside from the partnership statement, is to protect the integrity of the department. So if there's anything that we can do by statute, for example, that would further prohibit forever the reemployment of the individual, notwithstanding, of course, being pardoned, that's something perhaps we can look at. I mean, that's the extreme type of punitive action we can take. But if you find it necessary, I mean, this is not a one-off car wash. This is $2 to $2.5 million that are generated on an annual basis. So if there's anything we can do to help you, Mr. Kupiners and the superintendent and your team, that's something we're looking towards. I know that the PTO issue is a quagmire. We've been handling as a transitioning president in the past. Thankfully, we had a good president who gave me boxes and boxes of receipts and statements, and that's not uniform. What I do find that's a challenge, and I'm working with our chairman on Rev and Tax, is the barrier to entry for not-for-profits to register is so high. I think there's a minimum threshold, and at that 1 year or 2 years, Mr. Chair, they waived it. But I think to register a not-for-profit requires, I don't know, $500 up front. I mean, if you don't even raise $500, it's really kind of ludicrous that you require them to pay that. So perhaps in this context of DOE, PTA, PTOs, a nominal amount like $10 to register, because I believe, and I'm no expert, that the chain of custody and accountability begins with the official recognition of the parties involved. You can't hold someone accountable if they're not officially stated somewhere when there's a chain of custody changing, because you are in fact the responsible party. And so that's probably one thing that can aid in the process of being much more accountable. My last question, Mr. Chair, would be, Mr. Superintendent, or to any member of your team, are there any corrective actions taken against, I know you flagged them, that's your term you're using from internally, the administrative controls, as evidenced through Munis, for example, they didn't do certain things online. But let's say a school, are there instances where schools are persistently not reporting or have been called to question on more than one instance in terms of accounting for certain monies? And if so, does that school get put on a watch list or a high-risk list of your own?
So I know that internal audit will address how they look at it system-wide. From an accountability standpoint, there's a couple of things that we do and that we need to work on. I mean, obviously, the interaction between Frank's office and Deputy Superintendent Cruz is a constant, method for ensuring that as he flags issues, that she is able to directly address administrators and their responsibilities. Now, what we're finding though is that we can, there's some of that is, we got to sort through what are these reconciliation issues that can be addressed easily. What are the training issues if we're seeing recurring issues, but it seems that the individual has not mastered the skills needed. These positions, we need to really address make sure that those basics are handled, and then beyond that, there are areas that we need to strengthen now that the system's in place, now that we're regularly flagging. So those are the discussions that we've had. So as we've built this system, there are things that have occurred to me that we can do internally. Right, number one, continue what we've done in the past, which was we really had to standardize the responsibilities at the school level for who handles the munis system and the school treasury functions. So right now the expectation is, of course, the principal is responsible, but we made sure that every elementary school had an administrative assistant who would be charged with handling those basic responsibilities, and every secondary school had an administrative officer, which is a higher level because of the volume and complexity of those transactions to be able to handle those systems. And those would be the ones that we focus on with regard to training. It used to be that when we had a munis training and a NAF training, all of a sudden multiple people in different positions would show up. So you might have a school aide who was just working in the office, a clerk, AA. So we said, look, we want some expectations to be set, so when we go to a school, we know who is charged with handling that. So that's very clear. I think number two is that, and this has been with the advice of the internal audit folks as well as others, that we have to be really clear about what happens when administrators shift or retire, as well as when AAs or AOs shift in positions, that when we transition, we make it very explicit that the clearing of NAF becomes a part of that checklist before that transition can be completed. So as you've seen me trying to look at how to balance and how to address administrative responsibilities, I think the issue is, even though it's encouraged and in many cases practiced, we want to make sure it's an explicit part of, if you're an administrator going from your school to the other school, you clear with the person coming in, you clear NAF, and then you clear NAF on the school that you're going to. So there's going to be that exercise of how you clear NAF before you take over the other school and leave your former school. So I think it's been practiced, especially by your most vigilant administrators who insist that before I take over, I need audit to come in here and show me that the books are clean. That's very important, and so forth. And related to that comment, as we clear NAF, you'll see some of the variances that exist in the audit reports, and I want to just make this comment as a side note, just so you're clear, and Frank is working to address this through this audit function, is that some of the variances are not just a fiscal year variance, but these are carryover variances that could have come before we were here in the system. So some issue that might have happened in 2010 could continue to have an effect on how we are balancing accounts. And we talked recently about, well, how do we write off that amount? When do we write it off? When does it become uncollectible? And that's something that has a more technical approach based on the audit responsibilities and oversight that he's working on. So so I think there's that. I think the other piece we're looking at is, now that we're regularly flagging, so with Frank's, I won't say, I'll just say jokingly, his deficiency is that he really wants to ensure that the first level of discussion with the schools is to ensure that they get some kind of guidance and support to meet their responsibilities. So when we flag an issue, he will make sure you make contact with them, tell them this is the documentation that's needed, make sure they're clear, and do all of that. What we've said is, the minute you hit a quarterly report where documentation has been submitted, we need to explore and examine the consequences, but explore freezing that account right away. Instead of saying, hey, we're going to give you another chance, give you another week, we should probably look at something more stringent to put administrators on notice that you can't continue this activity if you just have failed to respond. And there may be other reasons, but it's a priority. And we know that administrators have many responsibilities, but it's one thing we want to examine in terms of that. And then the other final piece I'll mention is the central office. This is a school-based responsibility, but we have to think about the central office responsibility as well. And so right now, Taling, who is back at the office leading a couple of other meetings, is tasked with focusing on how we can get central notification of bounce checks or insufficient funds or issues at the banks immediately. We're looking at waiving the fee for online banking that the banks charge. because some of our schools are opting to just go save money and just go do paper statements, which will obviously contribute to a lag in information. And then also visibility at the central office, particularly for internal audit, into bank statements, so that all that information coming from the banks is immediately available. Because sometimes if there's a lag in information, we won't be aware until they think to call the central office. And so that's those are some of the suggested improvements for internal. With regard to the lawmakers and what you can do, I really do think that this discussion about accountability, particularly if a person has left the system or for any other reason, there's some limitation that we, in terms of restitution as well and other penalties, we need to look at that, because for us, there are certain limitations to our ability internally to handle these situations, and we turn that over to law enforcement if it becomes a criminal matter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In my closing statement, I'll reserve comments on the munis for another opportunity to talk technology with you folks. But I do want to commend your team, Mr. Superintendent, for being responsive, thorough, and highly receptive to the recommendations of the committee. Again, our motive is to protect the integrity of the department. We're partners in this education enterprise. But I do want to leave you, Chief Auditor, with a recommendation, at least, and I'm being partial, Mr. Chair. Perhaps then you can further establish a technology platform that can enable folks to report real time in terms of, let's say, chain of custody. Something, it's so passe, but it's something that always comes out is maybe an app. Something as simple as an app that upon the initiation, this amount has been transitioned, and then boom, you get that instant notification, so that it's not delayed until Monday that somebody has been notified that, in fact, at that point, the volleyball club president can say, I attest that 500 was raised at this, and then the responsible administrator can assume responsibility, and that's notified to you, so that anything that happens between Friday and Monday is accounted for. Just food for thought, relatively nominal. It'll cost you less than $10,000 to save perhaps $100,000, and so that's just an enabling platform. And I do want to ask one more of the Chief Auditor, the hotline number that was mentioned. If you have it, I'd love to have the number. You don't have to state it yet. If you don't have it, please send it my way when you get it. I give you my cell number to give it to me, but that'll be problematic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lohan, sir, I know you wanted to say something. You're eager to say something. Please do.
Good morning, Senators. San Agustin, Senator Castro. Board Member James Luan. Being an experienced advisor in the clubs when I was a teacher not too long ago, the rigors are there for the clubs, the rules, the standard operating procedures. It's very stringent. It makes it difficult for the clubs to even register. That's how tedious it is. So checks and balances are there for the clubs and for the students and teachers. My understanding of observation with how money is mismanaged basically lies in the business office of the school itself. I know we get a lot of flack from Central. There's a lot of downward push on obedience with our funding. We see that in the clubs. But when it comes to the business office of the school, I see some inefficiencies within that. One, lack of manpower. Two, probably a lack of expertise. Maybe we need an accountant. So those are the kind of understanding that I see. The discretion of the principal, the discretion of transfer of funds, those are probably the areas where we need to further strengthen. For example, if student funds or the NFA funds are not exhausted by the end of the year, whatever the remaining balance in there, to my understanding, and to many of the advisors' understandings, is that money is transferred into the principal's fund in that sense. Now, we're never given an explanation as to what that fund is used for, but that's my understanding. And with an enrollment of an organization, for example, let's say the basketball club, when we enroll as a club for the school, we have to cite down in the Constitution exactly what fundraisings we have to do in detail. I said, that doesn't go in the Constitution. But apparently they put every little lifestyle of the club into the Constitution. So that's how stringent it is. Now, again, when the club decides to use this money for certain things, the principal has the authority to say no. And throughout the schools, mainly in the high schools, many times I've heard my colleagues state as advisors of those clubs that they couldn't spend it on certain items. So therefore, at the end of the school year, funds are left over. You know, as a club, you want to try and expend all that funds. Yes, by the end of the year. Now, some of them who continue to become advisors the following year, they've asked a question about rollover. You know, they said it was not permissible. So every year, a club, in order to enroll as a club, they have to put a down payment. How do you get the down payment? So that's how stringent it is. So in that sense, now so from there, I'm saying, you know, I told the superintendent when we heard of the issue, is that make sure that when we do, you know, correct these situations, that it doesn't fall back down onto the students and teachers again. I said, I think our main thing now is just to strengthen the administrative value of the business office and what type of authority the principal has over the discretion of the funds. And I think that's where the bulk of our problem is at. We're pushing towards the middle where the funds get transferred from, you know, the first party to the third party, which is the central office. So somewhere in between is that second party that needs to be corrected. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Lon, I would highly recommend to the schools that, number one, if it's a chess club, I'd use chess club as an example, maybe the basketball club. If they raise money at the end of the year, they don't use it, it should stay with that club. It shouldn't go to the principal. The principal didn't raise that money. It was the chess club members. It should stay with that club until that club is dissolved. All money spent, because the following year, there's still students that help raise that money with hopes to continue using. Money should just roll over. It just needs to be accounted for. That's all it is. But I don't believe. I have a very serious reservation with the principal saying, "I'll decide where the money goes." If we're sitting in this room together, and here the superintendent is here, but if I put $100 and we all put 100, he's not going to tell me how to spend my 100. We will all agree, and that's the way the system should work. When the chess club, basketball club, racquetball club raise money, gosh, spend it. And if you don't spend it this year, then roll it over for the next group of folks, because it's the same students. And the folks that graduate are going to come and help that same club raise money to keep going.
Maybe the accountability would be much better because the money is still there.
That's correct. And you know, because you're the board members, put that in your board policy. Just correct it. And I know the superintendent's going to say, sure, let it roll. So, don't give the principal. Don't end up at the superintendent's fund. You know what I mean? I'm just kidding.
No. Obviously, we get concerns and issues that are raised, and you know, in the past year, it was really one of the interventions was when an organization was trying to spend all this money down, and we're informed, or you know, that they may not be able to spend it. Then obviously that amount would be lost to that organization. But I just mentioned to Mr. Mendiola that I believe that's in the board policy, and if they're going to address it, we can review that matter and look at the transfer of that. That issue, and then address it. Hopefully, and then we'll all clarify that.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So the board policy does specify that any unused balance in the student activity fund, the SAF, must be remitted and transferred into the TAP at the end of the fundraising period, which is the school year. And simply the design of that was to ensure that when you have a fundraising activity, you're not having a revolving fund and a banking accounts. You're looking at a graduating class of 2017. They're not fundraising for the graduating class of 2018. They're fundraising specifically for their student body. So with the expiration of those commencement services, then we close that down. That account is audited and it's transferred, if there's any remaining balance, to the TAF. And that TAF, while it's administered by the business office, it's really not in their direct auspices to just decide where they choose that money. There's certain guidelines of how that money's spent as well. And the general guideline is that the expenditure of those funds in the TAF have to go to the benefit of the student body and the school. So when fundraising is not expended in a given year, then the administrators, and you oftentimes see them at this time of the year, using those funds to kind of support facilities and maintenance. They're getting people at the school, buying, water baths, or doing that type of work. To speak to the matter of how the funds is governed and is it the administrator's responsibility, there's a very prescribed process. In order to be chartered as a club, you have to have an administrator's approval that you are going to fundraise for this specific event. You have to have a club advisor and a treasurer, and you have to have a money committee. So in order to disperse that amount, you're fundraising for an approved activity, and you're fundraising to do a certain event. Let's say we want to do a field trip. So when we fundraise and we say we're going to go on a science field trip, then the administrator allows those activities, and the money committee within the school club directs the disbursements of those funds. If they fundraise and they said they were going to do a field trip, then that money has to be expended for the dedicated fundraising purposes. So the administrator has to make that judgment call and say, okay, field trip is not going to happen. We're going to use it for such, such, and such. We're going to have a class party. And in those kind of situations is the administrator's call to make sure that the fundraising money was used as prescribed by the dedicated purpose for the fundraising activity.
Understood. Auditor's office. How are you guys doing? You got 6. You're losing people. You're gaining people. You have a salary problem. That should be a superintendent issue, right? That should be settled at your level, right, superintendent? Where I know that the superintendent has the authority to adjust the salary when hiring folks, right? Up to step 10. No, you don't have that flexibility.
Our auditors are part of the civil service. We follow the compensation study that's adopted by the executive branch of government. So on that pay scale, there's governing salaries that are prescribed to my position and to the auditors in my office positions.
Okay. But are you losing anybody? Are you gaining anybody? I mean, what's your number of staff that you should have? Because you got more people there than DOA has. You know that, right?
Yes, and we also have an equal amount we have half of government in terms of size. When you look at the amount of and the scope of work that our office does, we have 4,000 government employees. We also have approximately 40% of the revenues in appropriations from the government. In addition to that, we have anywhere from $60 to $80 million in federal grants, and then we have a mandate for charter schools, which comprises of $7 million. We have NAF of $2 million, and then we have other mandated responsibilities as prescribed in a special conditions letters that leads us to the high risk and CCAP. So when you really look at the scope of services your internal audit office providing at GDOE as compared to other internal audit offices and in terms of size, scope, and mandated responsibilities. Just by the way, we're the only internal audit office with mandates, with mandates from the legislature. So there is like the superintendent said, we reconstituted the office, and then there's so many additional responsibilities that we've taken on, and I think it's absolutely necessary and critical for the department to have a fully functioning and effective audit office. To answer your question, have we recently lost some staff? I think that's the nature of the profession. It's a very competitive profession. There's highly skilled employees that are really of high need. And just last year we lost our CPA who moved to a private sector position.
She moved to OPA? He or she? Well, the reason why I brought this up is because, there are other agencies that have auditors. And maybe, as you don't have a sign saying, hire our folks, maybe you should go out and ask and try to get some of them. There's auditors over at Revenue and Tax. Yeah. they'd probably be willing to move. It'd be a lot easier than what they're doing over there. I mean, they have a lot of people. You think you have a lot of people? Everybody that files taxes gets audited by revenue and tax. So,
yeah, you know, it's I appreciate the work that they do. I think the internal audit is a key component in terms of moving the department forward, and I think the leadership of the superintendent to empower these folks in the internal audit. I guess one of the challenges, you know, as these folks with a set of skills that are very technical in nature, they often get headhunted. And I do know that, you know, at as an example, at the Office of Public Auditor, she always states the case about, you know, she has to keep these technical people in their positions. And one of the challenges is the compensation packages that are afforded to these folks. So rest assured that I do know that as a part of our plan in terms of the budget and finance within the department, we need to strengthen these types of department or sub-departments within the organization to ensure that you know, we can minimize you know, the case for fraud or any of these things, especially with internal audit. And I, you know, put the challenge out to the superintendent. I said, you know, one of the toughest things right now that we're having to deal with is, of course, a third-party issue regarding federal dollars. And if we can realize, and I believe we can empower our people more within the department to take over some of those responsibilities and bring it into full compliance with what they have planned, that we'll be able to take some of those resources and really invest it back into our employees so that we can keep them whole, keep them here in Guam. I mean, it's very tough and very challenging in any organization. I know before the legislature increasing the minimum wage and then the cost of living on Guam, but when you have technical people who have advanced degrees who go out there and get into these professions, and most of these guys, the hours that they put in is a substantial amount of hours that they put in to ensure that the public trust is gained through their efforts and their works. So I know, and I guess the silver lining in this roundtable here today is that I know when we have a discussion, at least as a board member, when we have a discussion with the Education Committee, that there's always some fruitful result that comes out of it. And you know, I cannot express it enough that you know, I really appreciate the opportunity to come before the committee, and I'm glad that our team is here, our board members are here. We understand the importance. We understand that we really need to wrap ourselves around these issues that are plaguing our department. And then the only way we can do that is by getting the resources and putting the right people in place so that we can continue moving the department forward.
Mr. Superintendent, you want to make any final statements?
Yeah, I do want to make a final statement because I do hope that you know, the public will listen in, and especially those who are interested in this issue. But I do want to make sure that I also leave this roundtable with something I believe the both of you also, I know many around this table also understand, is that we've been talking about, you know, some of these issues, and I'd like to you know, we asked about the percentage of risk and so forth, and there's always going to be some risk, and we've been talking about that risk for the most of this hearing. But I do want to say that for the most part, what happens around these activities are you know, being conducted by teachers and parents and many students and family and friends who are looking at raising funds to support our students. So for the most part, you know, we appreciate that that work and effort on the weekends and the, you know, extra hours after school that all of them put in to try to raise these resources. So we frown very heavily. We want to hold accountable those who are abusing the system. But I also want to recognize the fact that so much work gets done by I don't want to paint everybody with the same, you know, paintbrush. That we know, because I know, you know, very intimately that the teachers are there with the students, doing the fundraising activities, scrubbing those tires, or making those T-shirts, all of the, you know, after hours without compensation, mostly to support, you know, the things that we want for our kids. So I want to just leave that and say, you know, we want to support that effort, and that means that we have to be, you know, strengthen our accountability efforts to make sure no dollar, no cent gets wasted and abused and stolen as part of you know, this effort. So I just wanted to thank you for allowing me to make that statement.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent, and the board members that have participated today, and staff of the Department of Education. One area I want to just comment before I wrap this up is, you know, every school has their logo, no? GW, Gecko, ZF calendar. Superintendent, auditor, take a look at it. There's probably only 3 schools that are registered patent. You got PTOs, you got vendors out there, PTOs committing to vendors for schools. That don't sound right, okay? If anybody's going to commit to anybody, it should be the superintendent. Every logo, every school is owned by the government, by the Department of Education. It's not owned by the PTOs. Take a look at it. There's a lot of students out there. There's parents. Take a look at your uniform program. That deals with a lot of your nonprofit out there. Okay, watch out for that. That being said, if there's nothing else that anybody wants to bring up, and then the committee will conclude the roundtable. Public reminder: the committee will continue to receive any testimony, any comments that the people of Guam would like to submit to the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation. Submit it to via email, Senator Joe S. @gmail.com. My office is located at Rand Care Building, 2nd floor, Suite 3, 761 South Marine Corps Drive, Tamuning, Guam. Si Zeus Masu for your attendance and participating in today's hearing. And for those at home, thank you for watching. It is now 10:38. This concludes the roundtable.